Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat sore semuanya. Semoga dalam keadaan sehat pada sore hari ini. Sebagaimana yang tertera di kontrak kuliah, kalau untuk minggu ini adalah minggu terakhir kita mempelajari tentang sebenarnya konsep PBO itu seperti apa sih? Sejauh mana sih perbedaannya dibanding dengan pemrograman terstruktur? Sebelum minggu depan kita masuk kepada pengerjaan tugas 2 untuk mata kuliah PBO. Untuk materi minggu ini yaitu exception handling. Jadi apa sih exception handling ini? Konsep yang pertama, exception handling adalah suatu fitur yang terdapat dalam bahasa C++ yang berperan ketika terjadi error atau kesalahan pengetikan kode program atau error yang lainnya. Sehingga program C++ akan mengalihkan atau melemparkan error tersebut ke sebuah pesan kesalahan, seperti error message. Jadi, kalau misalnya kita membuat program, error, tidak akan mungkin kita menampilkan kepada pengguna tampilan merah-merah, error line sekian. Kemudian ada error library-nya kurang, misalnya seperti itu. Atau tidak dikenali function-nya. Pengguna akan bingung kalau misalkan akan ditampilkan sebagaimana compiler asli C++ itu memberikan reaksi terhadap program yang error tersebut. Oleh karena itu dibutuhkan konsep exception handling yang bertugas untuk mengalihkan atau melemparkan error tersebut ke suatu halaman, biasanya halaman landing page seperti under construction. Mohon maaf, website ini sedang dibenahi kembali lagi dalam beberapa hari, misalnya seperti itu. Nah, itu juga bentuk salah satu exception handling. Konsep dari exception handling ini bisa diterapkan di berbagai bahasa pemrograman, seperti C++, Java, kemudian Python, kemudian PHP, itu ada konsepnya. Jadi memang seputar penanganan error atau kesalahan. Mekanisme yang paling diperlukan dalam menangani error yang terjadi pada saat runtime atau program berjalan, atau yang lebih dikenal dengan sebutan runtime error atau RTE. Bentuk penulisan exception handling seperti ini: try, throw x, catch, parameter. Ini adalah bentuk sederhana atau sintaks dari exception handling. Bagian dan fungsi C++ exception. Bagian-bagian dari fungsi terbagi 3 bagian untuk exception handling, yaitu try, throw, dan catch. Try, seperti ini ya, try, memungkinkan untuk menentukan blok kode yang akan diuji untuk kesalahan saat sedang dijalankan. Sedangkan throw X. Maksudnya adalah melemparkan pengecualian saat masalah terdeteksi yang memungkinkan kita membuat kesalahan khusus. Kemudian yang terakhir adalah catch parameter, memungkinkan bisa menentukan untuk mengeksekusi blok kode jika terjadi kesalahan dalam blok percobaan. Ini adalah kode dengan penjelasan, kalau misalnya masih bingung ya, try itu apa, throw itu apa, catch itu apa. Di sini saya buatkan sintaks exception handling dengan penjelasan atau komen. Try, kemudian baris kodenya apa, kemudian throw x, pernyataan pelemparan. Kemudian nanti catch parameter, respon tangkapannya apa. Kemudian ada catch parameter lagi, bisa ada banyak catch dengan parameter yang berbeda tergantung dari kebutuhan programnya. Kemudian respon tangkapan seperti apa, si out-nya. Kemudian catch lagi, default catch jika tidak ada parameternya. Yang cocok, maka akan dijalankan. Kemudian respon tangkapannya seperti apa? Biasanya akan berlawanan antara catch yang di atas dengan catch yang di bawah. Sama seperti if-else. If-nya apa, else-nya apa. Begitu juga dengan catch yang di atas. Jika memenuhi syarat, maka dieksekusi. Jika tidak, maka akan muncul error yang akan menangani permasalahan tersebut. Kira-kira seperti itu. Kemudian ini yang sederhana, karena ini kan banyak ya, catch-nya ada beberapa. Ini adalah yang paling sederhana. Try, kemudian kode program, throw exception, exception akan melempar jika ada masalah pada kode program tersebut. Kemudian catch, kode untuk menangani masalahnya. Nah, di sini perlu diperhatikan, jika penulisan program benar atau tidak ada error, maka exception akan lolos. Namun jika salah, C++ exception akan melempar dan catch akan menangkap untuk menangani permasalahan tersebut. Jadi tidak akan menampilkan error-error yang sebaiknya diketahui hanya oleh programmer atau developernya saja. Ini adalah contoh programnya. Sama ya, tetap include IOStream using namespace std, integer main, try, cout, selamat belajar C++, throw 1. Nah, di sini kita melemparkan sebuah integer 1. Cout, pernyataan tidak akan dieksekusi, endline. Catch, integer A. Blok ini akan dieksekusi, cout, pengecualian akan dieksekusi, endline. Catch, titik, boleh ya, titik-titik yang menandakan parameternya itu tidak di default seperti integer A di atasnya. Jika selain integer, maka blok ini akan dieksekusi. Cout, default, pengecualian, dieksekusi, endline. Return, 0. Maka ketika ini kita jalankan di compiler akan seperti ini. Karena di sini throw 1 adalah integer, maka pengecualian akan dieksekusi. Selamat belajar C++, pengecualian akan dieksekusi. Sedangkan kalau misalnya nanti ketika pengguna tidak menginputkan integer, misalkan huruf T, misalkan seperti itu, maka akan keluar default pengecualian dieksekusi. Kemudian contoh program lainnya seperti ini, include IOStream, include string using namespace std, integer main, try, di sini ya, try, kemudian integer val sama dengan 0, cout masukkan grade Anda. Kemudian if val besar 350, cout selamat Anda lulus tes CPNS. Else throw 20. Catch, cout tes gagal. Grade Anda harus besar 350 untuk dapat mengikuti tes selanjutnya. Cout error number. Nah, setelah ini dimasukkan ke dalam IDE, kemudian kita compile, hasilnya adalah diminta untuk memasukkan grade dulu, 70. Kemudian, misalnya 70 ya, kemudian akan muncul pasti tes gagal. Grade Anda harus besar 350 untuk dapat mengikuti tes selanjutnya. Error number 20. Ya, karena ini if, else-nya throw 20. Maka yang dilemparkan adalah 20. Kemudian kita lihat kalau kita memberikan inputan besar dari 350, misalkan 400, maka yang akan dieksekusi atau muncul pada hasil compilernya adalah masukkan grade Anda 400. Selamat Anda lulus tes CPNS. Nah, yang seperti inilah yang sebaiknya ditampilkan kepada pengguna instead of line-line merah yang berisi notifikasi, line error, tidak ditemukan library-nya, atau yang modelnya seperti itu ya. Jadi tidak ada kejelasan yang membuat pengguna itu bertanya-tanya apakah ini inputan saya sudah betul atau belum. Kemudian kenapa tidak ada respon apapun ketika ketik 40 dengan 400 misalnya seperti itu. Jadi harus ada, kalau misalnya sesuai berikan respon, tidak sesuai juga harus diberikan respon. Jadi tidak hanya yang betul saja yang diberikan respon. Jadi yang error pun juga tetap harus ada responnya terhadap si penggunanya. Kemudian ada lagi yang namanya C++ Standard Exception. C++ juga menyediakan pustaka semacam library-nya untuk standard exception, yaitu untuk menangani dan menerima argumen berupa objek standard exception. Jadi jika kesalahan pada ruang lingkup try tanpa melempar, standard exception tadi akan menerima objek dari kesalahan tersebut dan kita dimungkinkan untuk mengakses pesan kesalahan di dalam objek tersebut. Kita lihat penulisan sintaksnya untuk yang standard exception, try, kode, kemudian catch, standar, exception, dan E. Cout, error, E, what, and line. Contoh programnya seperti ini. Include iostream, include exception, include array using namespace std. Integer main, cout awal program, try, array, integer 3, data 1, 2, 3. Kemudian cout data, add 5, and line. Catch, exception, dan E, cout, E, what, and line. Cout akhir program. Maka, apakah hasilnya? Dari kode program ini, kita bisa tahu bahwa yang diminta adalah mengeluarkan array sejumlah 5, sedangkan pada datanya hanya ada array-nya itu sebanyak 3. Maka otomatis akan dieksekusi ini. Catch, exception, dan E, cout, E, what, and line. Inilah yang akan dieksekusi oleh program ini. Sehingga akan menghasilkan hasil pada compiler yaitu awal program ini, kemudian array at n which is 5 besar sama dengan nm which is 3. Sehingga tidak akan mungkin bisa ditampilkan datanya 5 sedangkan data yang tersedia hanya 3. Maka kemudian cout akhir program. Selesai. Berbeda halnya dengan ketika kita menginputkan atau ingin memanggil array elemen ketiga, juga akan error. Elemen kedua akan muncul 3, elemen pertama akan muncul 2, elemen ke-0 akan muncul 1. Seperti itu, seperti konsep array pada umumnya. Kemudian ini adalah contoh selanjutnya untuk exception handling. Include cstdlib, include iostream using namespace std, integer main, try, integer i, cout masukkan angka. If tidak sama, cin, i, throw, i. Catch, integer e, cout input pakai angka, bukan huruf. Maka seperti ini ya, kalau yang dimasukkan oleh pengguna adalah T3A, maka compiler akan menjalankan catch integer E, cout input pakai angka, bukan huruf. Sedangkan kalau kita masukkan angka, misalkan 44, maka tidak ada catch-nya karena tidak berupa error. Karena yang dimasukkan adalah angka, maka langsung saja akan mengeluarkan masukkan angka sama dengan 44. Dan karena di sini tidak ada cout yang menampilkan pesan, misalkan proses selesai, maka ini sudah selesai. Kemudian contoh program 5, double division, integer A, integer B, if B sama dengan 0, throw division by 0 condition, return A/B. Integer main, integer X sama dengan 50, integer Y sama dengan 0. Double Z sama dengan 0. Try, Z sama dengan division, X, Y, cout, Z, and line, catch, cons, char, bintang, MSG, message, char, message, and line. Ketika dijalankan, kita punya X, kita punya Y. 50 dibagi 0. Maka division by zero condition yang akan muncul. Bagaimana kalau kita ganti Y-nya menjadi 2? Apakah akan muncul division by zero condition? Tidak, karena 50 dibagi 2 sama dengan 25. Maka akan muncul hasilnya, yaitu return A bagi B atau A/B. Untuk mendapatkan 25, 50 dibagi 2. Kemudian untuk contoh program selanjutnya ada struct myException, public exception, constanta char, what, const throw, return C++ exception handling. Integer main, try, throw, myException, catch, myException, dan E. Nah, ini menggunakan standar exception. Standar cout, myException, standar cout, E.what, standar and line, std and line. Catch, std, exception, dan E. Maka ketika dijalankan atau di running akan muncul my exception handling, C++ exception handling. Jadi memang kalau untuk exception handling ini akan fokus pada penggunaan try, throw, dan catch. Catch-nya boleh dengan parameter, boleh dengan titik, titik, titik. Kemudian kita nonton video seperti biasa. Saya bukakan dulu di YouTube-nya ya, biar terlihat.
Second tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to begin talking about something called exception handling. Now, an exception is a way of handling an error that might occur when your program is running. For example, if you built a calculator and the user is trying to divide by 0, that may be an error that occurs when the program's running. Or if you made a game and you need a user to register. If they try to use like 999 as their age, that's unacceptable. So that may cause an error to occur. So let's go ahead and take a look at the syntax for this. Now, the first thing we need is something called a try block. Now, in this try block, this is where we write the code that we want to try, aka the code that we think an error might occur. So let's go ahead and make something like, I'm going to be making a simple program that takes two ages, the mother's age and the son's age. Now, we all know that a son cannot be older than its mom. So whenever the son's age is greater than the mom's age, this would of course cause an error. So let's go ahead and make two variable, int mom's age and int son's, actually might as well sum and equal to values right now. And mom's age equals like 30. Son's age, we'll set this equal to 34. Now we all know this is impossible, so let's go ahead and test it right now. So if the son's age is greater than the mom's age, then we want to go ahead and we want to do something called throwing an exception. Now, it's basically this. Whenever you have something that occurs that shouldn't occur, we need to tell the computer that an error did occur. And we do this by throwing an exception. And in order to throw an exception, go ahead and type throw and then type an error number. And you can make this any number you want. You can actually do other things besides numbers, but just throw a number because later on, say we made a program that checked for, 20 different types of errors, we want to know what error got caught. So let's go ahead and we already know that in our little manual, 99 means that the mom is younger than the son. So, it's pretty much just a reference number. So anytime we get an exception, and remember, anytime this line of code is going to run, it basically means that an error occurred. So now that we know an error occurred, we need a way to handle that error because we just don't want our program to freak out and shut down. So in order to handle the error, we do something called catch the error. Catching the error allows you to pass in that number, which is 99. So now x is equal to 99, and we can handle it a certain way. For example, we can just output to the user something like this. Son cannot be older than mom. And then for reference, we write error number, and this is where we write that x right there, end line. Just scroll ahead so you guys can see what I'm typing. So now, if we go ahead and run this, we can see, all right, whenever this program runs and the kid is older than the mom, then we have an error message that pops up that says son cannot be older than mom, error number 99. So, this is pretty much just for our reference, this error number. But let's go ahead and say that the mom was indeed older than the son. The mom was like 50 and the son was 34. Well, this is going to work fine. And this is never going to happen. So no error is going to be thrown. No exceptions are going to be thrown. So this catch block is just going to be skipped. So let's go ahead and run this. and we don't get any error messages. This program works perfectly. So basically, the concept of this tutorial is this. An exception is a way of handling errors that may occur when your program's running. For example, if the user tries to divide by 0, or pretty much if the user does something they aren't supposed to do. Now in the try block right here, this is where you write the code where the error might occur. And right after it, you need a catch block. Now the catch block is basically what to do if there is indeed an error. And if there is no error in this try block, then the catch block is skipped altogether. And just like a function, a catch block takes parameters. So it can take an integer, in this case, such as 99. And that's pretty much just like an error number. You know, whenever you're just playing on your computer and Windows messes up, you know how like the error message pops up? Well, that's pretty much what we're doing right here. It's like error message, yada, yada, yada. Do you want to send to Microsoft or do you don't want to send? And by the way, does anyone ever send those? Do they really get those error messages? I don't think so. But anyways, now you guys know the basics of exception handling. And by the way, if you guys are saying, you know what, Bucky, I could just have used an if statement and, you know, made a separate function for this. Well, I know that we can do this a different way, but exception handling is useful whenever you're trying to, you know, do computer stuff like allocate memory. I just want to show you guys a real easy example for this case, but I know that you could have probably made this program just by using a basic if statement and, you know, maybe a simple function or something. But I want to demonstrate the try and catch block and how to handle an error message. So these are useful for a lot more than, you know, comparing two variables. And there are some instances where we can't just make a simple program, that we need to use this exception handling. So for now, I just want to tell you guys that. So I guess in the next tutorial, I'm probably going to show you guys another example and show you guys how you can use a different parameter for this catch block right here. But for now,
Oke, kita lihat untuk video yang kedua tentang exception handling.
Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. In this video, I want to talk about exceptions and exception handling in C++. So I am going to show you how you can work with exceptions on a real life problem. So we use exceptions in order to handle different types of errors that can happen during the execution of our program. There are three most important keywords that you must know and understand if you want to work with exceptions, and those are try, catch, and throw. And in this video, I am going to explain all three. And in this video, we are going to simulate the work of a printer, and we are going to see what are some potential issues and errors that can happen during the execution of that program. And then we are going to see how we can handle those errors by using exceptions. But before I start explaining exceptions, I want to introduce you with a tool that I personally use in order to develop C++ applications faster. I am going to put it in the background. It's called C++ Builder, and you can use it in order to develop modern multi-platform applications with less code, because it has a lot of the components already available, so you can just use them and you don't have to write all of the code yourself. So if you have a great idea for an application that could make a lot of money or that could help to a lot of people, but you don't have time, you can use C++ Builder in order to help you to design a modern user interface and build that application much faster. So if you want to try it out, I am going to share my link in the description, which you can use in order to get 30 days free trial of C++ Builder. And I will even link a few videos with some of my ideas of the applications that you can build. So with that being said, now I'm going to return to explaining exceptions because errors can happen in any type of application and you should know how to handle them. And that is exactly what I'm going to teach you in this video. So as I already said, we use exceptions in order to handle different types of errors that can happen during the execution of our program. So let's create a program that is going to simulate the work of a printer, and then we are going to see what kind of errors and exceptions can happen during the execution of that program and how we should handle those exceptions. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to create a class called printer. But if you're not familiar with classes and object-oriented programming, I am going to link a playlist here and also in the description. So make sure to watch that first, and then you can come back to this video because you should definitely understand and learn about OOP if you want to learn C++. So make sure to watch that, and then you can come back to this video. So let's create a class called printer. I will say class printer, like this. And this class will have two private members. The first is going to be the name of the printer, and then second is going to be available paper. So how much paper there is inside this printer. So let's create those. Let's say string name, and then let's say int available paper. Like this. Okay, so these two members are private because members of a class are private by default. And then I also want to create public members for this class. So the first thing that I want to be public is constructor of this class. So let's create a public constructor. Let's say public, and then printer. Okay, so this is going to be the constructor of our printer class, and this printer constructor will receive two parameters, so name and available paper, so that we can construct a printer object. Let's do that. Let's say string name and then int paper. So what I'm going to do inside our constructor is I will say that the name of my printer will be equal to the name that we received in our constructor, and then available paper will be equal to paper, like this. So with this, I have created a constructor for my printer class, and this is, of course, a very simple example of how a printer class should look like. You can, of course, add more properties and methods to this class here if you want it to be a representation of a real-life printer. So one more thing that I want to add to this class here will be a method called print. So let's do that. Let's create a method of return type void, and let's call it print. Okay, and what this method here should receive is a text document that it should print. So I will say string, and let's say txt doc, so text document. Okay, and what I want to do inside this print method is I want to print this text document. So I am going to say cout, and then let's say printing, and let's write the text of this document here, and I'm also going to add an end line like this. Okay, so in order to test this method, let's create an object of printer class, and then we are going to construct that object, and then we will be able to invoke this method for the object of printer class. So I am going to say printer, and let's call it my printer. And here I am going to construct that object. Let's call it HP DeskJet 1234, for example. And then let's say that it has 10 papers inside it. Okay, so after I have created my printer object, what I can do is I can invoke this method. So I'm going to say my printer dot print. And what I want this printer to print is the following text. So I will say, hello, my name is Saldina. Let's say I am a software engineer. Okay, and this should be capital letter S and then here capital letter E like this. So if I run this program, let's see what is going to happen. Okay, as you can see, it says printing, and then this is the text that it has printed. So my name is Saldina, and then I am a software engineer. Okay, perfect. One thing that I would like to do in order to improve this method here is I would like to check how much paper is required in order for this text document to be printed. And then I also want to check if there is enough paper available. So let's do that. Let's make that calculation. I am going to create a variable of type int, and I will call it required paper, like this. And I will say, for example, that on one sheet of paper, you can print 10 letters, for example. So I'm going to say txt document dot length, like this, and then I will divide that by 10. Okay, so what this calculation here will do is the following. So if this text document has 40 characters, for example, and if we divide that by 10, we are going to get 4, which means that it is required to use 4 sheets of paper in order to print this text document. Okay, so what I want to do now is before I try to print this document, I want to check if there is enough paper available. And I am going to do that here. I will say if required paper is greater than available paper, what I'm going to do in this situation is I will throw an exception. So if we need more paper than we have, we are going to throw an exception. And in order to do that, we use throw keyword. And here I will throw a text exception, which says no paper, like this. So if this here results as true, if there is not enough paper available, we are going to throw an exception. But if this here results as false, we are just going to print this document. And then what we should also do is we should subtract. So we should say that now available paper minus equals to required paper. So I am going to subtract required paper that we just used in order to print this document from the paper that is available inside our printer, so that when we come to this function next time, we have less paper. Okay, now one thing that many beginners do is they do the following. So they say if required paper is greater than available paper, so if we don't have enough paper, please throw an exception and then return, like this. And this is actually redundant because if this exception here is thrown, it is not going to continue the execution of the function. So this return is redundant because this throw is going to break the execution of the function. So I'm going to remove it. Okay, and this here is enough in order to throw the exception and break the execution of the function. So if I try to test this method now, let's see what is going to happen. But instead of testing it once, let's invoke it 3 times, for example. So if I run this program, as you can see, inside our console, we have printed the document 2 times instead of 3. And then we have this exception which says unhandled exception at this location in exception cpp.exe and so on. So By doing this, we have crashed our application. And now I'm going to show you how you can handle this exception that we have thrown from our print function. So let's stop our application. And in order to handle this exception here, what we need to do is we need to put the code that we expect to throw an exception inside a try catch block. So I am going to put this inside a try block. So I will say try like this, and I will move all of the code inside this try block. So I will say, please try to execute this code here. But if you get an exception, you are going to catch that exception and you are going to handle it inside this block of code here. So inside this catch, we are going to catch a specific type of exception. And since we are throwing a text exception here, we need to handle that same type of exception here. And that type is const char pointer. So I'm going to say const char pointer, and I will call it txt exception like this. So what I want to do inside this catch block is I will write out that an exception has happened. So I will say exception like this, and then I want to write out the text of that exception like this. So we have thrown this exception in the situation when we need more paper than we have available. And then we are going to handle that exception in this block here. Okay, so if I run this program, as you can see, our document has been printed 2 times because we have enough paper for that. But if we try to print it 3rd time, we are going to get an exception which says no paper. Okay, now this exception here can be of any data type that you want. And here I'm throwing a text exception and then also handling that same type. But you can also throw an integer exception, for example. So let's do that. Let's say that if this error here happens, I am going to throw an integer number of 101. So 101. And then in order to handle this exception, we will need to write a different catch block. So if I leave it like this, and if I try to handle this integer exception using this type of catch block, we will get the same error that we had previously. So if I run this program, as you can see, we get unhandled exception because here we are throwing an integer exception, and here we are trying to handle only a const char pointer exception. So again, in order to handle this type of exception, we will need to write a different catch block. So let's stop our application and let's write another catch block. And yes, you can write multiple catch blocks for one try block. So now I have one try block and then one catch block, and then I'm going to add another catch block. So I will say catch. And this time, what I want to do is I want to handle a different type of exception, which will be integer exception. And let's call it EX code. So exception code. And what I want to do inside this catch block is I want to write out that code. So I will say exception and then EX code like this. So in this situation, you are going to just give the code of the exception to your user, and then you can write out the message that he should, for example, call support center, or that he should check out the documentation in order to understand what this exception code means. So if I run my program now, as you can see, here we have exception 101. So since we have thrown an integer exception, we have handled that exception in this integer catch block. There is also one very specific type of catch handler, which is called default handler. And that means that it is going to handle any type of exception. So the same way that this catch handler is going to handle only integer exceptions, and then this one is going to handle only const char pointer exceptions, we can use default handler in order to handle any type of exception. So how would you use a default handler? Well, you would say catch, and then here inside these parentheses, instead of putting a type like here and then here, I am going to put 3 dots like this. Okay, and this here means that this catch handler will handle any type of exception. So I am going to write a message here which will say cout, and then let's say exception happened. Like this. Okay, so this catch block is going to handle every single type of exception in the same way, which means that it doesn't really matter which type of exception we throw. We are going to come here and then we are going to handle it in the same way. But since we have 2 catch blocks before this default handler, that means that we are first going to try to execute this handler, and then if this type of exception is not thrown, we are going to continue and then try to execute this handler. And then if this type of exception is not thrown, then we are going to proceed and execute a default handler. So in this situation, we are throwing an integer exception, which means that this catch block will handle that exception first. So we are not going to be able to execute our default handler. So in order to test this default handler, what I have to do is I have to comment this integer handler first. So after I have commented this handler, if I run my program, let's see what is going to happen. Okay, as you can see, it says that exception happened. So we have handled an integer exception using this default catch handler. Okay, so let's close this application. And if I try to throw a text exception here, which says, for example, like this, when this exception is thrown, we are going to come to this first catch block, and then we are going to try to compare the data type that was thrown with this data type that is handled here. And if they match, we are going to use that handler in order to handle that exception. So since we are throwing a const char exception, we are going to handle it here. And if we want to test this default handler, we will have to comment this as well. So if I run my program now, as you can see, we are again handling that exception using this default handler. And this time we are handling a different type of exception, which means that indeed we can use a default handler to handle any type of exception. Now, there is one very important thing that I want to mention related to this default handler, and that is following. So if I uncomment this handler and then this handler here, and if I try to move this default handler to be at the beginning, we are going to get an error which says that handler is masked by default handler, which means that if you put a default handler at the beginning, that default handler is going to handle every single error, every single exception that happens, and then neither one of these 2 catch blocks is ever going to be executed. So you cannot do that. If you want to have a specific handlers for specific data types, those would come first, and then a default handler would be last, like this. So one more time, you put specific handlers first, like we did here, and then a default handler comes last. So if we try to run this program now, as you can see, we are handling this text exception using this const char pointer handler. Okay, and then if we try to throw an exception that is not handled here nor here, then this default handler is going to jump in and handle that exception. So let's go through this example one more time. Here I have created a class called printer that has a name and available paper. And then I have created a constructor for that class. And then here I have a method which is called print that receives a text document that it should print. And then here I have a calculation that tells me how much paper I need in order to print this text document. And I have hard-coded that on each sheet of paper, we can put only 10 characters. And you can, of course, increase this to 100.
Oke, sudah melihat ya dengan jelas penjelasan dari dua video tadi tentang bagaimana cara membuat ataupun step by step pengimplementasian dari exception handling. Kemudian kesimpulannya adalah exception handling merupakan mekanisme yang paling diperlukan dalam menangani error yang terjadi pada saat runtime atau program berjalan atau yang lebih dikenal dengan sebutan runtime error. Secara umum, adanya kesalahan atau error yang terjadi pada program saat runtime dapat menyebabkan program berhenti atau hang. Untuk itulah diperlukan mekanisme untuk memastikan bahwa program tetap dapat berjalan meskipun terdapat error yang sedang terjadi. Secara umum, exception handling dapat dilakukan atau dihandle atau ditangani dengan menggunakan keyword try, catch, try, throw, catch. Oke, ini latihan untuk minggu ini tentang exception handling. Buatlah sebuah program login sistem yang meminta inputan username dan password dengan dilengkapi exception handling. Rincian program sebagai berikut: username boleh nama, string, atau angka integer yang terdiri dari kombinasi nama dan angka. Password boleh nama, string, atau angka integer atau terdiri dari kombinasi nama dan angka. Program akan menangkap dan menampilkan pesan atau message apabila terjadi kesalahan saat proses login dilakukan. Contoh, login fail, username atau password salah. Program dapat menampilkan exception ketika kita menambahkan tanda baca atau karakter unik saat proses login dilakukan. Jadi, ketika kita membuat form login pun, form registrasi, kita juga membutuhkan exception handling. Nah, ini silahkan dicoba di ID-nya masing-masing untuk membuat program login sistem. Kira-kira begitu ya untuk pertemuan minggu ini tentang exception handling yang juga sangat berguna ketika kita membuat project dengan kode program. Bahasa apapun, bebas ya bahasanya, karena setiap bahasa pemrograman pasti akan ada exception handling-nya. Hanya sintaksnya berbeda. Untuk throw, catch, dan try-nya akan tetap sama, setahu saya. Karena di Java juga ada try, catch, dan throw. Kemudian di PHP sintaksnya berbeda ya, sepertinya tidak try, catch, dan throw. Saya lupa kalau untuk di PHP, coba nanti saya pastikan lagi. Sedangkan untuk C++ juga ada try, throw, dan catch. Kira-kira begitu ya untuk pertemuan minggu ini. Untuk minggu depan kita masuk ke tugas 2. Teknis atau mekanisme tugas 2-nya akan saya sampaikan di e-learning seperti biasa. Itu saja yang bisa saya sampaikan pada pertemuan minggu ini. Kita ketemu lagi minggu depan. Saya akhiri. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.